The legend of the Prince of Darkness has expanded over a century since Bram Stoker wrote the epistolary Gothic horror novel Dracula in 1897. Film and show adaptations of Dracula crowd the media. In fact, Stoker made the vampire trope so famous that it inspired countless other books and novels, which were also translated visually. But Count Dracula is still considered the original immortal, the father of the undead. His classic story with his love, Mina, and the complicated relationship Dracula had with Mina's husband, Jonathan Harker, is usually the basis of film adaptations. Sometimes his nemesis Van Helsing is the focus, but we rarely see Dracula's loyal servant, Renfield, in front and center. So today, we cover his story, Renfield, Dracula's familiar and most devoted disciple. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you liked our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Making of a Madman. In the classic book, R.M. Renfield was a lawyer who traveled to Transylvania to close a real estate deal with Count Dracula. But unbeknownst to him, the Count starts to manipulate and feed off him. He promises Renfield immortality in exchange for servitude. He intends to enslave Renfield and turn him into his familiar. A perfectly sound lawyer becomes a frenzied disciple over time. He develops cravings for living creatures and blood. In his mind, he can absorb the life force of living creatures by consuming them. It started with bugs, then moved up the food chain with birds and rats. At one point, he asked for a cat. Dracula got him addicted to insects by indulging him into believing that the blood of any living thing is the beginning of immortality. He was so possessed by the idea that at some point in the novel, he licked the spilt blood off the floor. Renfield's primary job was to serve his master in turning Mina Harker into a vampire in Bram Stoker's novel. So while he was devoted to his master, Dracula always used him as a means to an end. If one draws parallels with more recent vampire characters in media, then this trope of the need to please is all over the place. In Anne Rice's famous series, Interview with the Vampire, Lestat is the master, and Lewis is the fledgling. Although the two have a complicated bond of friendship, love, and hate, Lewis is seduced by Lestat to accept his death and life as a vampire. Dracula and Renfield's dynamic could have inspired this relationship. A human so enamored by an exponentially strong and charismatic immortal being that he willingly gives up his humanity, the submission of the self. Plagued by the boredom of a simple life and regular problems, they opted for something greater, which eventually left them broken. Lewis could never come to terms with his vampiric nature, and took in a young girl as a daughter. Once Lestat caused the death of his daughter, he was finally able to discard Lestat completely. In Stoker's novel, Renfield never dwells on the immorality of helping Dracula turn Mina into a vampire until he meets her. At this point, his conscience beats him over the head like a jackhammer, and he begs Mina to flee, and even throws himself at Dracula to allow Mina some time to escape. This decision resulted in Dracula snapping his neck for defying him. His choice of humanity over devotion to a cruel man led to his death in the end. Renfield Syndrome. The term Renfield Syndrome was coined in the 1980s to define clinical vampirism, an obsession with drinking blood. It's clear that Bram Stoker left quite an impact on Renfield in clinical psychology. Although Renfield's character wasn't a vampire, he craved to be one, and therefore the bloodlust haunted him constantly. The relationship between Dracula and Renfield is much like DC's Joker and Harley Quinn. Harley met Joker as a fine working psychologist, but eventually, Joker managed to seduce and manipulate her into becoming his loyal slave with empty promises of companionship and love. So did Dracula with Renfield, with false promises of eternal life. It drove him mad and landed him in Dr. John Seward's sanatorium. Once the Prince of Wallachia managed to turn Renfield into a raging lunatic, the duo traveled to England, where his deranged behavior made him a point of fascination for psychologists, and he was hospitalized by force. Dr. Seward studied his behavior and symptoms all throughout the book, while Renfield was busy letting Dracula inside the sanatorium to feed on Mina Harker. Seward describes him as a 59-year-old man with great physical strength, who's morbidly excitable by the idea of eating creatures full of blood, but also suffers through periods of gloom. In his journal, he writes, "I presume that the sanguine temperament itself and the disturbing influence end in a mentally accomplished finish. A possibly dangerous man, probably dangerous if unselfish." The evolution of Renfield in pop culture. The first time Renfield was seen on screen was in 1922, in F.W. Murnau's German silent film Nosferatu. Murnau didn't have the rights to Stoker's novel, so he changed the names of all the characters. Renfield became Knock, an unhinged servant to Nosferatu, who delivered Jonathan Harker's character to Dracula Nosferatu. Knock is locked up in a sanatorium, but manages to escape and terrorizes a village, while his master hunts Harker's wife. The same narrative follows in the 1979 film Nosferatu the Vampire by Werner Herzog. However, the most iconic representation of Renfield was in the 1931 American film Dracula, and all actors who have played Renfield since take notes from the 1931 film, when Dwight Frye brought the character to life. He was introduced as a sane lawyer, but his descent into madness progressed as the film progressed. Frye's performance bordered on the camp aesthetic. At the same time, the rest of the cast was more stoic with their deliveries, apart from Bela Lugosi's Dracula, who occasionally intrigued the audience with his theatrical intonations. But Frye's choices and techniques defined Renfield for what he is. His metamorphosis from a composed solicitor to a raving, mad, inhuman creature left quite an impact on the audience. His transformation is further underscored in the infamous Rats monologue, delivered with an almost ecstatic enthusiasm, and it is a pivotal moment that encapsulates his crazed and corrupted servitude to Dracula. Renfield speaks of rats, rats, rats! Thousands of them offering their lives in service to his master's will. He was a wide-eyed, cackling freak show whose mind was confined by an animalistic drive for blood, which he believed would lead him to his original desire, immortality. As the vampire trope became more and more romanticized in media, narratives of modern-day Dracula evolved, where Renfield would become an inconsequential character. The film Horror of Dracula from 1958 and Frank Langella's 1979 version totally ditched Renfield. Meanwhile, Jesus Franco's 1970 film Count Dracula stayed close to the original novel, featuring Klaus Kinski as a super low-key and arid Renfield. This take was more about a quiet dread. His cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs personality took a backseat until Ford Coppola's adaptation, Bram Stoker's Dracula in 1992. However, even in this film, Renfield is not as essential to the story. He helps Mina escape the clutches of the Count at the end, but for the most part, he's jealous of her for receiving love and attention from Dracula. Television went all out with Renfield. Weirdly enough, his longest gig was in the British kids show Young Dracula from 2006, which played out for 5 seasons. Simon Lutters played him as a complete train wreck, but still fiercely loyal to his master and his family. He was a butler to the Drac family for centuries in the show. Fast forward to 2014, Sam Barnett featured as Renfield in the Showtime horror drama Penny Dreadful. He had a whole new vibe there. A lonely, awkward secretary to Dr. Seward, who gets pulled into vampire drama and becomes Dracula's creepy servant. In the 3rd season of Penny Dreadful, Renfield keeps trying to manipulate Vanessa Ives and spies on her at Dracula's command. He becomes obsessed with Vanessa Ives under Dracula's influence and is constantly battling against his Dark Master's overpowering control. Renfield is presented in a sympathetic light in this show. In the 2013 NBC TV series Dracula, Renfield is a completely sensible man. He meets Dracula for the first time when the latter is trying to purchase a controlling interest in a mine. He's moving to the modern world, and Renfield helps him out as a lawyer. In this TV series, Renfield is a black man who's cast aside by his colleagues even after passing the bar exam. Then there's Dracula, who also feels out of place in a world that has left him centuries behind. Both of them find comfort in each other, as they recognize themselves as social outcasts. Dracula hires him as a lawyer, and Renfield is his constant confidant in the show. The 2020 BBC series Dracula focuses more on Dracula and his nemesis Van Helsing, who is a woman in this 3-episode show. The character of Frank Renfield had a minor appearance in the show as Dracula's lawyer in 21st century Britain. He has somewhat of an oddity about him, but he is of sound mind, just also inclined to serve Dracula without question. Finally, the most recent portrayal of Renfield was done by Nicholas Hoult in the 2023 movie Renfield. The actor took notes from the 1931 version of Dwight Frye's Renfield to play the role. The movie is set in the 21st century America, where Count Dracula is weak and vulnerable from his last fight with hunters decades ago. Renfield, still the loyal dog, fetches him food. In this version, Renfield is also blessed with immortality, but with conditions. He's under Dracula's influence and has to do his bidding. He came to Dracula's castle to strike a deal with him and give his wife and child a better life, but instead, he got stuck in an endless cycle of yes sirs. While Dracula feeds off human blood, Renfield finds his strength by consuming insects. The filmmakers took his clinical vampirism and made it literal. In the original story, he thinks that by eating bugs, he will eventually gain immortality. In this movie, he actually gains superhuman strength from eating them. He goes to AA meetings for people suffering from toxic relationships and finds comfort among humans. When it clicks that he does not have to follow Dracula, that he can defy his master and get his life back together, he retaliates. It's an action-packed horror comedy that takes a fun but true-to-character turn with Renfield. Marvelous verdict. In the Dracula mythos, Renfield stands out as a fascinating piece with an enduring position. He serves as a mirror to the themes of submission, obsession, and the corruptive pull of absolute power, which is central to Dracula. From his early depiction as a frenzied, bug-eating aberration in Bram Stoker's novel to his many reinterpretations in later films and shows, Renfield's character consistently embodies the devastating effects of vampiric influence on the human psyche. He's not just the Dark Prince's minion, but a symbol of humanity's fragile and susceptible nature, and how we're so easily drawn to forces beyond comprehension because of our insatiable greed. You can totally see the parallels between Renfield and other subjugated characters in vampire lore, such as Lewis from Interview with the Vampire. However, Lewis was never technically a servant, but was still under his maker's spell for a long time. Then there's Guillermo from the comedy horror TV series What We Do in the Shadows, whose desperate servitude to his master echoes Renfield's obsessive loyalty. Similarly, the familiars in Blade are a modern inspiration from Renfield, highlighting his parasitic nature and the transactional relationship between humans and vampires. Even DC's Harley Quinn shares an unreciprocated love with Joker, just like Renfield's one-sided devotion to Dracula. These characters, inspired by Renfield's archetype, explore themes of power and balance, dehumanization, and the links one might go for perceived immortality or purpose. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone!